A nation that stretched across 11 time zones, a superpower whose economy supported millions with guaranteed housing, education, and healthcare. Then imagine that same nation imploding within months, leaving its people grappling with poverty, despair, and disillusionment. This is the story of Russia's shock therapy, a radical economic experiment that turned the country into a case study of what happens when capitalism is imposed at breakneck speed. To understand this upheaval, we must first explore the backdrop, the Soviet Union. Established in 1922, the USSR was not merely a country, it was an ideology in action, claiming to embody the principles of Marxism-Leninism. For decades, the Soviet system was characterized by a command economy, centralized planning, and state ownership of industry. It achieved remarkable feats, sending the first human to space, defeating Nazi Germany in World War II, and becoming a nuclear superpower. But beneath these triumphs were deep cracks. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was stagnant. Corruption was rife, consumer goods were scarce, and technological innovation lagged far behind the West. Gorbachev reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, sought to modernize the USSR, but they also unleashed forces he couldn't control. Ethnic tensions, demands for independence, and economic chaos snowballed into a full-blown crisis. By December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, dissolved by leaders of its own republics. Enter Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation. Yeltsin inherited a country in turmoil, shrinking economy, rising nationalism, and widespread uncertainty. To address these challenges, he turned to Western economists and institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, who advocated for shock therapy. Shock therapy was rooted in the belief that transitioning to capitalism should be as rapid and sweeping as possible. The idea was that short-term pain would lead to long-term gain. Its architects like Jeffrey Sachs and Anders Estlund argued that gradual reforms risked a return to socialism. Instead, they pushed for a clean break, dismantling the planned economy in one fell swoop. The first step was lifting price controls, which had kept goods affordable during the Soviet era. Overnight, prices skyrocketed. In January 1992 alone, basic necessities became unaffordable for many. A loaf of bread that once cost a few kopecks suddenly cost several rubles. Hyperinflation reached 1,354% that year, wiping out savings and plunging millions into poverty. For ordinary Russians, this was a nightmare. Imagine an elderly pensioner who had saved her entire life under the Soviet system, only to find that her money was now worthless. People began selling heirlooms, furniture, and even clothes in makeshift street markets just to survive. This period became a symbol of desperation, with grandmothers hawking antique samovars and men bartering tools for food. Unemployment, a concept virtually unknown in the USSR, surged as industries shut down or downsized. State-owned factories, once the backbone of Soviet life, could no longer compete in the global market. Entire towns built around a single factory, known as monotowns, were devastated, leaving residents without jobs or prospects. Privatization was another cornerstone of shock therapy, and it was here that the seeds of Russia's oligarchy were sown. State assets, from oil fields to aluminum plants, were sold off at bargain prices. Ordinary Russians were given vouchers to buy shares in these enterprises, but most sold them for cash to survive. The beneficiaries, a small group of well-connected insiders who amassed vast fortunes almost overnight. Take the example of Roman Abramovich, who acquired the Sibneft oil company for a fraction of its value, or Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who became one of the richest men in Russia by acquiring Yukos oil. These oligarchs wielded immense power, not just economically, but politically, shaping Russia's future in ways that still resonate today. But the economic devastation wasn't limited to unemployment and inequality. Public services, once a hallmark of Soviet society, collapsed. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies, schools went without funding, and life expectancy plummeted. Between 1991 and 1994, the average life expectancy for Russian men dropped by 6 years, a decline comparable to that seen in countries ravaged by war or disease. This wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a humanitarian one. The chaos also gave rise to organized crime. The Russian mafia thrived in the lawless environment of the 1990s, infiltrating businesses, politics, and even law enforcement. Violent crimes surged, with contract killings and gang wars becoming disturbingly common. Despite the suffering, shock therapy had its defenders. Economists like Jeffrey Sachs argued that the reforms were necessary to prevent a total collapse and to integrate Russia into the global market. They pointed to the eventual stabilization of inflation and the rise of a consumer economy as signs of success. Critics, however, saw things differently. They argued that shock therapy was less about helping Russia and more about opening its economy to Western interests. The IMF and World Bank, they claimed, prioritized neoliberal reforms over the well-being of ordinary Russians. The rapid privatization of state assets was seen as a fire sale, benefiting foreign investors and a select few Russians at at the expense of the majority. One particularly damning critique came from Naomi Klein, who in her book The Shock Doctrine argued that shock therapy exploited crisis to push through unpopular reforms. In Russia's case, the shock of the Soviet collapse was used to justify policies that enriched a few while impoverishing millions. Today, the legacy of shock therapy is visible in every aspect of Russian life. The oligarchs who emerged during this period continue to wield enormous influence, both within Russia and globally. Inequality remains a defining feature of the Russian economy, with a small elite controlling the majority of the country's wealth. The political consequences have been equally profound. Yeltsin's rule, marked by chaos and corruption, paved the way for Vladimir Putin, who promised stability and order. But this stability came at a cost: the erosion of democracy and the consolidation of power in the hands of a single leader. The story of Russia's shock therapy isn't just a cautionary tale for economists. It's a reminder of the human cost of rapid change. It forces us to ask, was it worth it? Could a more gradual transition have prevented some of the suffering? And what lessons can other nations learn from Russia's experience? As we reflect on this turbulent period, it's clear that the promises of shock therapy, prosperity, democracy, and integration into the global economy came at a devastating cost. Whether that cost was necessary or avoidable is a question that continues to spark debate, but one thing is certain: the scars of shock therapy remain, a testament to the dangers of prioritizing ideology over humanity.